How is it that a university-trained New Testament scholar has an interest in Jesus as a Jewish person? My guest, Amy-Jill Levine, University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies, E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter, Professor of New Testament Studies and Professor of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt Divinity School and College of Arts and Sciences, also affiliated Professor Center for the Study of Jewish-Christian Relations in Cambridge. And her books include The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, The Meaning of the Bible, What the Jewish Scriptures and the Christian Old Testament Can Teach Us, and a long list of other publications. Perhaps of maybe the greatest interest of all is she was a co-editor of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, something that's never been done, but Jewish scholars who are not believing in Jesus with a sympathetic, annotated scholarly treatment of the New Testament. In other words, not attacking it, but seeking to place it in its first century Jewish background. Professor Levine, thanks so much for joining us on The Line of Fire today.
It's nice to talk with you finally.
Yes, I'm simply fascinated, as you as a Jewish academic, having this decades-long interest in Jesus and the New Testament. So how do you come to have this interest?
I think everybody should be interested in it. It rather floors me that we can even ask the question. For me personally, I grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly Portuguese Roman Catholic on the southeast coast of Massachusetts, and I was fascinated by the religious practices and beliefs of my friends, from the beautiful churches in which they worship, to saying the rosary at home, to singing Christmas carols in the public school system. And when we get on the bus, we talk about what we did in our religious education classes. So they talk to me about what they learned in their catechism classes, and I talk to them about what I learned in Hebrew school. And every once in a while, it turned out we had learned the same thing. And sometimes they would talk about this fellow named Jesus, who just sounded really interesting to me. So that's in part how the interest began. And it got pumped up when I was in second grade, and a little girl said to me on the school bus, "You killed our Lord." And I simply could not fathom how this tradition that seems so beautiful, and moreover, my parents had told me that Christianity was very much like Judaism. We worshiped the same God. We prayed the same prayers, most notably the Psalms. We took authority from the same set of scriptures. How could this tradition suddenly turn on me? So I started asking questions when I was 7, and I turned 60 last June, so I've been doing this a long time.
Wow, fascinating. So, from early roots on. So as you have studied over the years, and now your life is intersecting in these different cultures, I'm really intrigued to know how you look at Jesus, what you make of all of this, what you think the church may be missing about Jesus. But just in short, maybe in the shortest possible way we can sum it up now, then we'll get into it in the minutes that follow. Who do you personally think Jesus was?
I think he's a teacher who is invested in preparing his people for the inbreaking of the kingdom of heaven, or what Jews might call the Olam Haba, the world to come.
Okay, so do you think that he thought he was the Messiah?
He may well have.
Got it.
At the time, there was no set job description for the Messiah.
Right.
The major focus was less on the Messiah as a figure than on the Messianic Age. So could he have thought that he had a special commission to bring about that Messianic Age or to prepare his people for it? I see no reason why not.
Got it.
Clearly, his followers thought so, and they must have gotten that message from someone.
Got it. All right. Well, we're tracking on that in terms of what he believed and what they believed. We'll be right back with Professor Amy-Jill Levine. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. My guest, Professor Amy-Jill Levine, her most recent book, I've read some excerpts from it, Short Stories by Jesus, the Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi. Dr. Levine, we know in terms of Jewish background to the first century and some of the work of David Flusser on the parables and things like that, that when we look at Jesus as a Jewish teacher, he certainly fits in that time frame very well. How are the parables used? Is this a common thing in your view in ancient Judaism, and Jesus therefore would be a representative rabbi?
Yeah, I think so. Parables are a form of wisdom literature. And we've got examples of parables from the Tanakh, from the book of Judges, from 1 Samuel, Nathan's famous parable of the ewe lamb that he tells to King David. A number of the Proverbs have a parabolic form in that they compare one thing to another. And rabbinic literature is replete with parables because the rabbis are not only good legalists, they're also very good storytellers. So, yeah, I think he fits in well here. He also fits in with the broader Roman and Greek context because Aesop's fables have a parabolic connection.
All right. Now, you're reading this through the eyes of a Jewish academic, not primarily through religious eyes. So in that sense, you maybe come to the text with a lack of certain biases or preconceptions. What do you think that the church is missing sometimes when it reads the parables of Jesus?
Oh, darling, we all have biases.
Yeah, well, I know. I'm just trying to, set things up.
We try to be objective, but that's never going to work fully. What I try to do in the volume is not only imagine what Jesus' parables might have sounded like to the people who first heard them before the gospel writers get a hold of them and figure out in what context they're going to put them and how they might provide explanations for them. But I also looked at how over the centuries from the church fathers on, a number of Christian interpreters misunderstanding Judaism or simply dismissing Judaism imported very negative stereotypes onto the parables and thereby created an anti-Jewish veneer to travel along with whatever message they thought the parables conveyed.
So could you give me an example of that?
Sure. The idea to take two very famous parables, that in the parable of the Good Samaritan, that Samaritans are the oppressed minority and Jews are terrible people because they hate Samaritans, and the whole thing is about the Gentile mission. Well, Samaritans and Jews basically hated each other. It's not a majority versus minority group. And Samaritans actually are a problematic category in early Judaism because Jews could not tell exactly how they were related to Samaritans. So the question of who is my neighbor is very, very well addressed with the question of the Samaritan. This has nothing to do with the Gentile mission. As far as the prodigal son goes, the standard reading is that the Jewish God was distant and angry and wrathful, and therefore the dad in the parable should have been expected to beat the younger child or dismiss him or make him work for the next 40 years. And consequently, Jews would be surprised that God was merciful. It's just nonsense. It takes away the benevolent, careful, compassionate God of Judaism, and it takes away any sort of ethical import to the parable.
Right, absolutely so. When I came to faith in Jesus as a Jew, my upbringing a little different in terms of I got caught up in the counterculture movement of the 60s and was a drug user for a couple of years and had a radical conversion experience. But I grew up without really any exposure to anti-Semitism in the community in which I lived. All my friends were Jewish. We went to school with kids that were Gentile and nominally Christian, but we all hung out together. And so once I became a believer in Jesus, the local rabbi gave me a book about anti-Semitism and church history written by Malcolm Hay. And it was a shocker because I didn't know such a thing existed. I wasn't familiar with church history. No one had come up to me and called me a Christ killer or accused me of deicide or anything like that. And yet the reality is it's not just that there have been horrific things done over the centuries by professing Christians to Jews, but there has been a mindset with which Scripture is read. So this complete contrast that now John 1:17, these are completely different worlds. The law under Moses, bad, old, that's passé. Grace under Jesus, now this is the new thing, whereas the contrast was not that dramatic.
Exactly so. Jesus did not invent grace. I mean, it's already there in the Jewish tradition. What I find with most of my work is I'm not dealing with like rabid anti-Semites. I'm dealing with very well-meaning scholars and very well-meaning priests and pastors who would not have an anti-Semitic thought. But what they wind up doing is repeating things that they've heard from their teachers or from their religious educators when they were children. And they can't hear how horrible their comments sound because they're simply not attuned to it. In the same way, I remember back when I was a child, every once in a while adults would say when we were being rambunctious, stop acting like wild Indians. Well, today we realize that that's a racist and offensive comment, but at the time we simply could not hear it. And what I'm trying to do in a good much of my work is to open up the ears of Christian commentators, saying you don't mean to sound anti-Jewish, but that's the message you are conveying. You don't need to make Judaism look bad in order for Jesus to look good.
All right, so let's say we look at some of the major works of Christian scholarship a couple generations ago, something like the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, and the editor of the first half, Gerhard Kittel, was actually a Nazi. A great scholar. There's amazing scholarship in the 10 volumes, and of course it's an older work, but you're just thinking, okay, all we're getting is text, all we're getting is information and philology and exegesis and lexicography and all that, whereas there was a certain bias that ran through these texts almost unconsciously. Right,
and we still use those resources today. And unless students are aware of the biases, they might take as this is what, quote-unquote, gospel, rather than this is one opinion and it's colored by a certain tendentiousness for which we need to be on the lookout.
All right, so what would be a caricature of first century Judaism or Pharisaical Judaism? What would be a caricature of that maybe just your average Christian would hold to today?
I'm not sure there's an average Christian.
Okay.
Christians are just as diverse
Correct.
as Jews are. But in terms of fairly common stereotypes, there are a number of them. For example, that Judaism was so oppressive to women, it was oppressive and suppressive and depressive, and then Jesus comes along and invents feminism. That all first century Jews, and as soon as I hear all first century Jews, I worry about that, just like some sort of Jew thing. That all first century Jews are expecting a militant Messiah whose only agenda was to get Rome out of the country, and they rejected Jesus because he talked about turning the other cheek. That all first century Jews participate in a legalistic system and have no sense of the spirit of the law, have no sense on how the law functions in terms of sanctifying daily life, in terms of how the law functions as what we would call today multiculturalism. It was following Torah that prevented the Jews from assimilating into the broader Roman culture, and that's why we still have Jews.
All right, and in that context then, where would you say that the teachings of Rabbi Jesus could have been controversial, could have seemed either extreme or revolutionary or different? We understand not different in terms of a contrast between Judaism versus Christianity, but where might he have ruffled some feathers?
I begin with the idea that if you're invested in Torah, you're going to argue about it because that's what Jews do. So by arguing about Torah, about Sabbath practice, for example, or about dietary concerns, Jesus places himself right in the heart of Judaism rather than takes himself out of it. What he does regarding the law strikes me as actually an intensification of it rather than a liberalizing of it. He's very clear that the law says don't murder. He forbids being angry. The law says don't commit adultery. He forbids thinking about it. The law forbids taking false oaths. He says just don't take an oath at all, but always be honest. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. He debates with some people over what might be called the traditions of the fathers. For example, whether you have to wash your plates before you eat. That strikes me as well within the realm of first century Jewish concerns. The one place where I think he might have gotten some pushback, and you can even see it in the Gospels, is that at the time, Jews debated the circumstances under which you could get divorced. Everybody knew you could get divorced because Deuteronomy says you can get divorced. But there are some rabbis who say only in cases of adultery, which on its own requires two witnesses. Sloppy, if nothing else. And in other cases, something untoward on the part of the woman. And Jesus says don't get divorced. Or at least in Matthew and Luke, cited by Paul, he says don't get divorced. Mark and Luke, and in Matthew you get the pornea loophole. So I think he's putting a higher value on that marital bond. At the same time, I think the people around him are primarily celibate. So he's saying don't get divorced, but if you leave your wife, that seems to be okay.
All right, friends, we'll be right back. All right, I've got a few more questions for Professor Amy-Jill Levine. Again, her most recent book, Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi. Dr. Levine, you have scholars like Alan Siegel have written about the two powers, Margaret Barker, the great angel. There's different perspectives about ideas of these highly exalted angels or different aspects of divinity in the ancient Jewish world. Do you think there's any parallel in the ancient Jewish world through which Jewish followers of Jesus might have been able to look to Jesus in some divinized way?
Well, some Jewish scholars did look to Jesus in a divinized way. We would start with somebody like Paul. What folks have done through the centuries in terms of believers in Jesus may well come from the Jewish tradition. Could Jesus have been looked at as a super-duper angel? Sure. I think that's why the Epistle to the Hebrews goes out of its way to say, no, Jesus is not a super-duper angel. He's something more than that. Mm-hmm. But we know from the early church that there were many different ways of understanding Jesus. He was, completely God. He was maybe more human than God. There was some sort of spectrum. He becomes God at the cross. He becomes God at the resurrection. He's already the incarnated God. So even the New Testament gives us various ways that the early followers of Jesus attempted to make sense of this phenomenon that they had encountered, and they did their best to locate that phenomenon for those who were Jewish within their own Jewish tradition.
Could they do it in the context of monotheism?
I think so. Christians certainly seem to have done so. Mm-hmm. Was it confusing? Sure. It's like asking someone simply to explain the Trinity. Mm-hmm. And then we wind up with lots of technical terminology from the Greek. But Christians ultimately believe in one God, but they believe in one God with for me, the easiest way of doing it is in terms of three different job descriptions. So that sometimes when my Jewish friends will say, the Trinity is nonsense, I will say it is not nonsense. It actually has good philosophical backing. And the easiest way might be to think of it in terms of God the Creator, that would be the Father, God the Redeemer, that would be the Son, and God the Sustainer, and that would be the Spirit. And most of my Jewish friends say, yeah, that makes some sense.
Okay, hey, look, try explaining the Sphirot, among other things, in a simple way.
It's not easy.
All right, so suffering Messiah. Some scholars recently have tried to revive the idea that there was Jewish belief in a suffering Messiah before the time of Jesus. Some have looked to the Dead Sea Scrolls or the so-called Gabriel Revelation. Others, David Mitchell's really pushed this, and Martha Himmelfarb's pushed back a little about Messiah, son of Joseph. How far back does that go in Jewish thinking? And was there a concept of a suffering Messiah, son of Joseph in Jesus' day? What's your take, having looked at this for many decades?
Yeah, well, there's a Messiah, son of Joseph, who dies, and we have that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whether he is accorded value because of suffering is another question. We do know that the Talmud picks up the idea of the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 and speaks about the Messiah sitting among the people with leprosy at the gates of Rome, wrapping and unwrapping his bandages. So we also know that suffering could have some value in some Jewish thought, and we get that through the martyr tradition that comes in through 2nd Maccabees and then 4th Maccabees. So that does a suffering Messiah make sense in early Judaism? Sure. The very idea that Jesus, in whatever configuration he is found, makes sense in early Judaism has to follow because it was early Jews who made sense of it. Would other Jews have disagreed? Absolutely. When it seems to me, when it comes to religious claims, I don't personally find helpful apologetic approaches that attempt to prove the divinity of Jesus one way or the other. Yes, talk about historically, does he fit within his context? Absolutely. But when it comes to theological proof, that's not a matter of academics, and it's got nothing to do with what books we've read or how smart we are. Religious faith, belief, is a matter of grace. Otherwise put, it's more like love than it's like Sudoku. You believe it because you believe it, and then all that history can help you understand it better. But the initial belief does not come from proof texting.
Got it. Yeah, certainly that's the case in terms of where I came from. I didn't even know anything about messiahship of Jesus or Jewish apologetics or arguments when I had a radical conversion experience. Then, of course, studied, and the more I studied, the more these things made sense to me. But I'd be the last to say I just came to my faith through decades of intellectual study and then made a decision. So we come then to...
That might get you tenure, but it might not get you saved.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Okay, I don't know if you ever got a copy. I sent it through a colleague and signed it to you of my book, The Real Kosher Jesus, which I wrote as a response to Rabbi Shmuley's Kosher Jesus.
Right.
So I don't know if it ever got in your hands, but ultimately, because I'm involved in the polemical side, so I've got the academic side, and especially Near Eastern studies and all of that, and Old Testament, and then I've got the polemical debating side. So in that sense, more of a fundamentalist than you'd be, even though you go to an Orthodox synagogue, which is a whole other that's a whole other question. But is there in your conception of things, not as a person of faith, but as a historian, is there a place for this concept of Messiah, that the Jewish Messiah has a mission in two phases, that he does his priestly work of atonement first and then comes to finish his royal work? Is that, in your mind, a valid messianic concept?
Well, it's already a messianic concept, and it's not my job to judge what's valid or not. Is it in addition to what I find in the predominant Jewish sources? Absolutely. If you go back a little bit, a couple of centuries before Jesus, what you have is the idea of Elijah predicting the Messianic Age, not predicting the Messiah. And the Messianic Age is basically a one-shot thing. So the Messiah and the Messianic Age come as a package deal. If people decide to separate out the coming of the Messiah from the Messianic Age because the Messianic Age has not arrived yet, that strikes me as a logical move on the part of basic religious development. I'm not interested. I'm just not interested in telling people that their beliefs are wrong. I'm very interested in seeing how those beliefs become enacted in history. I mean, in other words, what does the belief then compel you to do? And I'm interested in how people explain their own histories. And I'm interested in what readings they take from Scripture, which itself will always open to multiple interpretations. And
you personally, as a Jewish person, expect there to be a literal Messiah one day?
Oh, I hope so. I hope there's a Messianic Age, and I really hope there's a resurrection of the dead. But it's not. These theological concerns are not really foremost in whatever makes me, and they never have been. Because I'm less interested in the philosophical and the theological concerns than I am interested in the textual and the practical. And I think that's simply the way my Constitution functions.
Yeah, fully understood. I asked out of curiosity entirely, knowing that it wouldn't be, in that sense, a direct intersect with the scholarship. And I appreciate your candor. Hey, it's been a delight having you on the air. Thank you so much. Deeply appreciate your time.
It's really good to talk with you. Thank you.